I knew she would be wearing red. She always wore red to the parties I hosted, as if the color itself were a message meant only for me. Vanessa Cole stood by the wall of windows in our Fifth Avenue penthouse, champagne flute tilted against her lips, laughing at something my husband had just murmured against her ear. I watched the two of them from across the room, the way you watch a car accident you already know is going to happen. His hand rested low on her back, easy and familiar, the hand of a man who had done this so many times he no longer bothered to hide it. She leaned into him. Nobody in that room needed a translator to understand what her body was saying. That was the particular cruelty of Manhattan society. Everyone saw everything. Nobody ever said a word. I shifted Theo higher on my hip. He was 8 months old, warm and solid, his small fist wrapped around a strand of my pearls. He had his father's dark hair and, thank God, none of his father's temperament. He wasn't crying, even though the room was loud and thick with perfume and money and the particular electricity of people pretending to like each other. You must be exhausted, holding him all night. The voice came from my left. Patricia Lowell, wife of my husband's largest investor, smiled at me with an expression that was doing its very best impression of sympathy. Her diamond tennis bracelet caught the light every time she lifted her martini. "Why don't you let the nanny take him for a bit?" "I'm fine," I said. "I like holding my son." "Of course you do." She took a slow sip, her eyes drifting toward Julian and Vanessa. "Some of us just have to work a little harder to keep our husbands interested, that's all." I didn't answer her. I didn't need to. Patricia measured her worth in her husband's stock portfolio and her own dress size, and she had never once understood that I had stopped competing months ago. I had stopped the night I found the receipt folded into the breast pocket of Julian's jacket. A suite at the Carlyle, charged to our joint account, dated a Tuesday when he'd told me he was in Chicago. That was 7 weeks ago. 7 weeks of smiling at dinner parties. 7 weeks of hiring a private investigator with cash my grandfather wired into an account Julian didn't know existed. 7 weeks of quiet, careful conversations in a lawyer's office with the blinds drawn. 7 weeks of waiting for tonight. Julian's voice cut through the noise, the particular register he used when he wanted a room's attention and knew he would get it. "Everyone, if I could have your glasses up for just a moment." The chatter died. Glasses lifted. Every eye in the penthouse turned toward my husband, who stood in the center of the room like a man who had never once doubted that a room belonged to him. He was handsome, I'd given that. Tall, broad through the shoulders, the kind of face that made strangers trust him within 30 seconds of meeting him. It was almost funny, considering Julian Calloway hadn't told a fully honest sentence in years. "To Calloway Capital," he said, raising his glass, "and to the Meridian acquisition, which just tripled the fund's returns for this quarter. None of it happens without an extraordinary team." A ripple of applause. "Vanessa, especially, has been instrumental in closing this deal." Vanessa blushed on cue, dropping her eyes, playing the modest protégé so well I almost admired the performance. I wondered if she knew he'd use that exact phrase, instrumental, especially, to describe his last assistant 3 years before he fired her for, in his words, no longer meeting expectations. His gaze swept the room and landed on me for exactly 1 second. I watched something flicker behind his eyes, the briefest acknowledgement that his wife existed. Then he looked past me, and I might as well have been part of the furniture. I carried Theo toward the kitchen. I needed 30 seconds of quiet, just enough to remind myself why I was still standing in that apartment at all. The plan was solid. My grandfather had reviewed every page of it himself. The evidence sat in a safety deposit box 2 blocks from his office. The jet was fueled and sitting on the tarmac at Teterboro, had been sitting there for 6 days. But standing in that glittering room full of people who either pitied me or didn't see me, I felt the weight of every silent year pressing down on my chest like a hand. The kitchen was empty. I set Theo in his portable bassinet on the counter and leaned back against the cold marble, closing my eyes. A few more hours, I told myself. Then you're free. Most wives would be jealous, you know. I opened my eyes. Desmond Calloway stood in the doorway with a tumbler of scotch, his face already flushed from the alcohol, his smile the same predatory curve as his son's. He looked like an uglier, older draft of Julian. Same cold eyes, same certainty that the world existed for his convenience. Excuse me? Don't play dumb, Vivian. It doesn't suit you. He stepped closer, swirling his drink lazily. Everyone in that room knows about Vanessa. Hell, my son's been parading her around for months. And you just stand there, holding that baby, smiling like you don't notice a thing. What's your point, Desmond? My point is, you're weaker than I thought you'd be. I figured a Whitlock would have some spine. He shook his head slowly, savoring it. But you're just a placeholder. A pretty face who married up and forgot how to fight. The words landed the way words like that always land, like a slap you refuse to acknowledge. I had learned a long time ago never to let men like Desmond see weakness. Predators only escalate when they smell it. I'm not going anywhere, if that's what you're implying, I said quietly. He laughed, an ugly sound that didn't belong in a room this expensive. We'll see. He turned and walked back toward the party, leaving me alone with his words still hanging in the air. I looked down at my son. He was awake now, blue eyes fixed on my face, his mouth working around some small private thought only babies understand. He had no idea his father was rotten to the core. No idea his grandfather was worse. But he would know someday. And I intended to make sure that by the time he was old enough to understand any of it, none of it would be able to touch him. I lifted him and carried him back into the living room. The party had climbed a register while I was gone, louder, looser, everyone 2 drinks further into the night. Julian was holding court near the fireplace, Vanessa perched on the arm of his chair like something trained to sit there. I saw the exact moment he clocked me across the room. His eyes narrowed. He said something to her, and she laughed behind her hand. Then he stood. Vivienne! His voice sliced through the room, and conversations died mid-sentence. Come here. It wasn't a request. It had never once been a request in 6 years of marriage. It was a command, delivered with the flat certainty of a man who expected to be obeyed without a flicker of hesitation. I walked toward him, not because I wanted to, because it wasn't time yet. But I kept my spine straight and my eyes level the entire way. When I reached him, he looked down at me with the particular contempt he reserved for public settings, the look he gave waiters who brought the wrong wine. You've been hiding in the kitchen all night, he said, pitched to Carrie. People are starting to think you're antisocial. I was checking on Theo. Theo is fine. That's what we pay the nanny for. He reached out and lifted our son out of my arms, not gently, not carefully the way you'd take a coat off a chair, and handed him to a passing server like an inconvenience he was finally free of. Take him to the nursery. The server hesitated for half a second, then nodded and disappeared down the hall with my child. My heart lurched hard enough that I felt it in my throat, but I kept my face still. Years of practice. There, Julian said, turning back to the room with a satisfied smile. Now my wife can actually participate in her own party. A few people laughed. Most looked at their shoes. Vanessa rose from the arm of the chair and crossed to us, her red dress catching the light, and looped her arm through Julian's like she had every right to. "Vivian," she said, sugar sweet, "you look lovely tonight. Is that dress from last season?" "It's from a designer you couldn't afford on your salary," I said. Her smile froze. Julian's jaw went tight. "Be nice," he said, low and dangerous. "I'm always nice," I said. "I'm just not fake." The silence that followed had a texture to it, thick enough to touch. Someone coughed. A glass clinked somewhere near the bar, and then Julian did the thing Julian always did when he felt even slightly cornered in front of people whose opinions mattered to him. He attacked. He closed the distance between us until I could smell the scotch on his breath, until his shadow blotted out half the chandelier light. "You want to play games in front of my investors, Vivian? Fine. Let's play." He turned to the room, raising his voice so it would reach every corner. "Let me tell you all something about my wife." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. 6 years ago, I married her because I thought she had potential. I thought she could be the kind of woman who stood beside a man and made him better. He let that sit for a beat, savoring it. Turns out she's spent 6 years doing exactly one thing well, and that's disappearing into a room the second things get interesting. I felt every eye in that penthouse land on me at once, waiting to see whether I'd crack. I didn't. "You know what's funny?" he went on, and his smile turned genuinely cruel now, the mask slipping enough that even the drunkest guest in the room could see what was underneath. "A real partner would have fought for her seat at this table. Instead, she hides in kitchens with the help. So go ahead, Vivian. Take your son and go hide somewhere permanent. See if anyone here even notices you're gone." The words hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. I looked at him. I looked at Vanessa, smirking behind her champagne flute like she'd already picked out curtains for my side of the closet. I looked at the guests, some embarrassed, some entertained, all of them waiting to see what the humiliated wife would do next. And then I did the only thing left to do. I walked down the hall to the nursery, took Theo gently from the confused server's arms, and lifted my clutch off the hall table on my way to the door. I didn't run. I didn't hurry. I moved the way you move when you've rehearsed every step of an exit 100 times in your head, lying awake at 3 a.m. for 7 straight weeks. As I passed him, I stopped. He was watching me with his arms crossed, triumphant, certain he'd won something. "Running off again?" he said. I met his eyes, and for the first time in 6 years, I didn't look away first. "No," I said. "I'm leaving." The door clicked shut behind me. The hallway was empty and cold after the noise of the party. The elevator arrived the instant I pressed the button, as if it had been waiting. I stepped inside, pressed the button for the lobby, and let my back rest against the mirrored wall. Theo fussed against my collarbone. I bounced him gently, humming the same 3 bars of a lullaby my mother used to hum to me. "It's okay, baby," I whispered. "We're almost there." 30 floors. 20. 10. My phone buzzed once inside my clutch and I ignored it. When the doors opened onto the marble lobby, I walked past the doorman who tipped his hat without a flicker of surprise and out into the cool November air. A black town car idled at the curb exactly where it was supposed to be. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door before I'd even reached it. "Mrs. Calloway." "Ms. Whitlock," I corrected. He nodded, unbothered, as if he'd been briefed to expect the correction. "Ms. Whitlock, your grandfather sends his regards." I climbed in and buckled Theo into the car seat that had been installed that morning while I was at a spa appointment I'd invented as cover. Then I sat back, closed my eyes, and let out the first full breath I'd taken in 7 weeks. The car pulled away from the curb. 10 minutes. That was all I needed. 10 minutes to the private airfield. 10 minutes to board the jet. 10 minutes to disappear from a life I had spent 6 years pretending to want. My phone buzzed again. And again. I glanced at the screen. Unknown number. Probably Julian calling from someone else's phone to scream at me before I could block him. I let it ring through to voicemail. Then it rang a third time, and this time the caller ID showed a name I recognized instantly. Nathaniel Whitlock. My grandfather. I answered. "Grandfather." "Vivian." His voice was calm, the way it was always calm. The voice of a man who had built an empire from a single cargo ship and had never once needed to raise it above a conversational register to be obeyed. "I watched the feed from the camera in the chandelier. We saw all of it." A chill ran the length of my spine. "You watched?" "We watched." A pause, deliberate, the kind he used when he wanted a sentence to land with weight. "We are very proud of you." I swallowed hard against the lump rising in my throat. "Thank you." "Now tell me you're safe." "I am. We're in the car, heading to the airfield." "Good. The jet's been fueled and waiting for 6 days." A brief silence. "Before you go, Vivian, I need you to do something for me." "What?" "Turn on the television. Channel 9. I frowned but reached for the remote built into the armrest. The screen flickered to life, already set to the right station, a red, breaking news banner scrolling beneath a reporter standing in front of a federal building I recognized from 100 financial news segments. My heart began pounding before I'd even processed the words on the banner. "Callaway Capital CEO indicted. SEC announces sweeping fraud charges. Assets frozen." I stared at the screen, unable to breathe. The reporter's voice came through the small speaker, clipped and serious. "In a stunning development tonight, the Securities and Exchange Commission has announced indictments against Callaway Capital CEO Julian Callaway and his father, company chairman Desmond Callaway. Charges include wire fraud, securities fraud, and the embezzlement of client funds totaling an estimated $380 million. All personal and corporate accounts have been frozen pending trial. Sources tell us the investigation has been ongoing for months, and that a key piece of evidence was provided by an anonymous whistleblower. Both men are expected to be taken into custody within the hour." The footage cut to Julian's office tower, already ringed with police cruisers, red and blue light bouncing off the glass. My grandfather's voice came back through the phone. "I told you I would handle it, Vivian. All I needed was the evidence you found in his safe." I remembered that night 4 weeks ago, Julian asleep beside me after too much wine, me slipping into his study and photographing the contents of a safe I wasn't supposed to know the combination to. Encrypted files, offshore account numbers, a ledger of shell companies with names like nesting dolls, each one hiding another. I had handed it all to my grandfather without asking a single question about what he intended to do with it. "How long have you been planning this?" I whispered. "Since the day you married him. I never trusted that boy for a single hour." And when you called me 7 weeks ago and told me what you'd found in that jacket pocket, I knew it was finally time to move." On the screen, the camera panned across federal agents entering the building. "They're arresting him right now," I said. "They are. And when they search his home office, they'll find something else. An insurance policy taken out on your life 11 days ago. $2 million. Julian as sole beneficiary." My blood went cold in my veins. "You knew about that?" "I have sources everywhere, Vivian, including at the insurance company that wrote the policy." His voice softened just slightly. "He was going to have you killed. Not today, maybe not this year, but eventually. That policy was his contingency plan in case the fraud unraveled and he needed a payout to disappear with." I looked down at Theo, asleep now in his car seat, one small fist curled beside his cheek, utterly unaware that his mother had just learned his father had priced her life at $2 million. "He's going to prison," I said slowly, "for a very long time. And when he eventually gets out, if he gets out, his name will mean nothing. His father will likely be dead or in a cell beside him. And you, Vivian, you will be the sole heir to the Whitlock fortune. Everything that boy ever wanted for himself, you will simply have." I felt something move across my face that wasn't quite a smile. It was the expression of a woman watching an enemy walk directly into the trap he'd spent years digging for himself, without ever noticing the shovel in his own hand. "Thank you, grandfather." "Don't thank me yet. The hard part starts tomorrow. You'll have to rebuild everything. Your name, your life, that boy's whole future. You'll have to learn how to trust people again, slowly, carefully." A pause. "But you can do it. I watched you walk out of that room tonight with your chin up. You didn't scream. You didn't cry. You simply left. That takes more nerve than most people will ever have in them." I blinked back tears I refused to let fall. "I learned from the best." "Flattery will get you everywhere, my dear. Now get on that plane. Take your son somewhere warm. When you're ready to come back, we'll finish what we started." "I will. And grandfather..." "Yes?" "Thank you for believing me before I even had proof." "Welcome to the family business, Vivian." He hung up. I sat in the back of the town car and watched Manhattan blur past the window, the news still playing silently on the little screen, footage looping of Julian being walked out of the building in handcuffs, his face somewhere between confusion and fury. I waited to feel something, grief maybe for the 6 years, or fear for what came next. Instead, I felt relief spreading through my chest like warmth returning to a limb that had gone numb. I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in longer than I could remember. Hope. The car merged onto the highway toward the airfield. I looked down at my son, his small chest rising and falling in the easy rhythm of a sleep undisturbed by anything that had just happened. "Did you hear that, baby?" I whispered. "We're free." The jet touched down on a private airstrip on Nantucket a little after 2 in the morning. The runway lit up like a runway in a movie about someone else's life. My mother was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, in a coat thrown over her pajamas, her hair loose for once, instead of pinned into the smooth chignon she wore for every public occasion. When she saw Theo asleep against my shoulder, something in her face cracked open. "You did it," she said, not quite a question. "I did it." She wrapped both of us in her arms right there on the tarmac, and for the first time in 7 weeks, I let myself cry, quietly, into her shoulder. The tears I'd been rationing out in private for so long, finally allowed to spend themselves all at once. She didn't say anything. She just held on. The house was the same as it had always been. Cedar shingles gone silver with salt air, a wraparound porch that faced the water, the smell of wood smoke and the ocean the moment you stepped through the door. I had spent every childhood summer in that house. It was the only place in the world that had never once made me feel small. I put Theo down in the nursery my mother had apparently had prepared for weeks. A small act of faith that told me she'd believed I would actually go through with it, even when I hadn't quite believed it myself. Then I found her on the deck at dawn, 2 mugs of coffee already made, steam curling up into the cold morning air. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. "Neither could you." "Your grandfather's been sending updates every hour." She didn't ask what they said. I hadn't asked either. I'd turned my phone off the second we landed and hadn't turned it back on, because I already knew what I'd find waiting for me. Threats from Julian's lawyers, panicked messages from people who'd called themselves my friends and were now scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal before it could stain them too. Let them scramble. I found I didn't care. "The news is calling it the biggest financial scandal on the East Coast in a decade," my mother said, wrapping both hands around her mug. 380 million missing. Thousands of investors wiped out overnight. The Callaway name is finished. Good. Julian's being held without bail. Desmond had a heart episode during the arrest. He's in the hospital. They're saying it's not looking good. I felt nothing. Not pity, not satisfaction, just a flat, wide-open indifference, like looking at weather in a country I'd never visit. "You're handling this remarkably well," my mother said, studying me with the same sharp gray eyes I saw every time I looked in a mirror. "I've had 7 weeks to prepare for it. Most people wouldn't be able to prepare for something like this. Walking out of a party with your baby while your husband is being arrested for fraud in real time. It sounds like the plot of a movie." It felt like one, too. "In the movies, the wife usually cries." She glanced sideways at me. "Did you?" "No, not once." I thought about it as I said it. Really thought about it. For the first time, letting myself run the whole reel. 6 years of marriage. The parties where I'd been treated like a well-dressed piece of furniture. The nights Julian came home smelling of a perfume that wasn't mine and offered no explanation because he'd stopped believing he owed me one. The pregnancy he'd been quietly resentful of because it interrupted a deal cycle. The delivery room he'd missed by 4 hours because a call couldn't wait. The 7 weeks of smiling through dinners while I built the case that would end him. "Not once," I said again. My mother nodded slowly, satisfied. "Good. Crying is for funerals, not for victories." She rose and went inside, leaving me alone on the deck as the sun climbed fully over the water, painting the whole sky in shades of orange I hadn't let myself notice in years. I stayed out there until it was fully light, then went in to check on Theo. He was awake in the crib, fists batting at the mobile above his head, and when he saw me, he made a sound that could have been a laugh or could have been a complaint about being left alone too long. Either way, it was the best sound I'd heard in months. I lifted him out and held him against my chest, breathing in the smell of clean skin and baby powder. "Good morning, little man," I whispered. "Today's the first day of the rest of our lives." He grabbed my finger and shoved it directly into his mouth. I laughed. It was the first time I'd laughed in what felt like a year. An hour later, I sat in my grandfather's study downstairs, the room he still kept stocked with everything a Whitlock might need on short notice, a laptop open in front of me, and a stack of documents fanned across the desk. He'd had everything couriered ahead. Divorce filings, a proposed custody agreement, a restraining order petition, and financial statements proving I had never touched a single dollar of Julian's stolen money. The desk itself was the same mahogany monster my great-grandfather had used to found Whitlock Maritime 100 years earlier, scarred along one edge where, family legend claimed, he'd once slammed his fist hard enough to crack the wood negotiating a shipping contract. I was halfway through the custody agreement when my phone buzzed. I'd turned it back on reluctantly, knowing I couldn't stay dark forever. The screen lit up with a number I didn't recognize. Hello? Is this Vivian Calloway? This is Vivian Whitlock. Who's asking? A brief hesitation. This is Detective Alvarez, NYPD. I'm calling regarding your husband, Julian Calloway. I'm aware of the situation. What can I do for you, Detective? We need you to come in and give a statement. Mr. Calloway is claiming you had knowledge of the fraud and personally benefited from it. A cold, familiar calm settled over me. The same calm I'd worn through 6 years of dinners with his father. Of course he'd try to drag me down with him. That was Julian's particular philosophy. If he was going to burn, he wanted to make certain the fire spread as far as it could reach. That's a lie. We'll need to verify that officially. Can you come in tomorrow morning? I can be there at 9. Thank you, Ms. Whitlock. I'll have an officer meet you at the front desk. He hung up. I set the phone down and stared at it for a long moment before returning to the custody agreement. My mother appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, drawn by something in my face. Who was that? The police. Julian's trying to implicate me. Can he actually do that? He can try, but I have proof I had nothing to do with his business. Bank statements, email records, witness testimony. Grandfather made sure of it months ago, before I even knew I'd need it. Your grandfather thinks of everything. He does. He taught me to as well. I looked up at her. I'm not running, Mom. Whatever comes next, the divorce, the custody fight, the reporters camped outside the building, I'm not running from any of it. She crossed the room and sat down across the desk from me, folding her hands in her lap the way she did whenever she wanted to say something that mattered. Vivian, I need to ask you something honestly. Are you sure? You could take what your grandfather set aside for you and disappear somewhere no one's ever heard the name Calloway. Raise Theo in peace, far from any of this. I considered it. There was something genuinely tempting about vanishing, starting over under a different name in a smaller city, letting Theo grow up without ever knowing what his father had done. But that wasn't who I was, and it wasn't who she'd raised me to be. I spent 6 years running from the truth about my own marriage, I said. I'm done running. I'm going to fight, and I'm going to win. Something shifted in my mother's expression, a rare, unguarded pride that transformed her from merely elegant into something close to beautiful. That's my daughter, she said. I flew back to New York the next morning. My grandfather had already arranged for a lawyer to meet me at the airport, a woman named Renata Cruz, exactly the kind of person I wanted standing between me and whatever Julian's team was about to throw at me. She was in her early 50s, dark hair pulled back into a severe bun, reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, a leather briefcase in one hand and a coffee in the other, waiting at the private terminal like she had nowhere else in the world to be. Miss Whitlock, she extended her hand. I'm glad to finally meet you in person. Thank you for coming on such short notice. Your retainer from my grandfather apparently buys round-the-clock availability. It does. Shall we? We walked to a black SUV idling at the curb. The driver held the door, and I slid into the back seat beside her. The situation is complicated, she said without preamble, pulling a folder from her briefcase before we'd even pulled away from the curb. Julian is claiming you were aware of the fraud from the beginning and actively helped conceal the money. He's produced what he says are email exchanges between the two of you discussing offshore transfers. That's impossible. I never discussed business with him. He never trusted me enough to let me anywhere near it. I know. The emails exist, but they're fabricated. Badly, as it turns out. I had a forensic analyst pull the metadata this morning. They were created 3 days ago on a machine registered to his personal assistant. Relief moved through me, cold and clean. So he can't hurt me with them. He can try, but every time he lies to federal investigators or tampers with evidence, he digs the hole under himself a little deeper. Judges do not look kindly on a man who frames his estranged wife while under federal indictment. She flipped a page. There's something else you should know before we get to the office. What? Julian's attorney has filed for visitation rights. He wants supervised time with Theo. My blood went cold and stayed there. Absolutely not. I agree. And based on the pattern of behavior we can document, the affair, the financial abuse, the insurance policy the SEC already flagged in their filing, no judge in the city is likely to grant him unsupervised access. Possibly not supervised access either, but he's going to fight it, because fighting it is the only leverage he has left. I looked out the window at the city sliding past, gray and indifferent, and thought about how differently I'd once seen all of it. I had met Julian Calloway 9 years earlier at a fundraiser my grandfather had dragged me to, the kind of black tie event where everyone's family name did more talking than they did. I was 24, freshly out of an architecture master's program, more interested in the building's cantilevered staircase than in any of the men circling the bar. He'd found me anyway, drawn a straight line across the room, and introduced himself with a confidence I mistook, at the time, for warmth. He was funny in those early months, attentive in a way that felt like being seen for the first time by someone who mattered. He asked about my thesis project and actually seemed to listen to the answer. He remembered small things, the name of my childhood dog, the fact that I took my coffee with too much cream, the anniversary of my father's death, which he marked every year without me having to remind him, at least for the first 3. I didn't notice the shift happening in real time. That's the thing nobody tells you about men like Julian. The change is so gradual, you spend years explaining it away as a bad week, a stressful quarter, a difficult client. By our 2nd anniversary, he'd stopped asking about my work entirely. By the 3rd, he'd started referring to my architecture license as my little hobby in front of colleagues, laughing like it was an inside joke we both found charming. I stopped laughing along around year 4. He never noticed I'd stopped. Theo arrived at the start of year 6, and for exactly 11 days, Julian seemed like the man I'd married. Soft around the eyes, careful with me, proud in a way that felt uncomplicated. Then the deal cycle picked back up, and he missed the pediatrician appointments, and the perfume that wasn't mine started showing up on his collars again. And I told myself, one more time, that I was imagining things. I found the receipt by accident, tucked into the breast pocket of a suit jacket I was sending to the dry cleaner. The Carlisle, a suite, charged to our joint account. On a Tuesday, he'd told me he'd be in Chicago closing the Meridian deal. I stood in our closet holding that slip of paper for 11 full minutes before I let myself feel anything about it at all. I didn't confront him. I'd learned enough by then about the particular flavor of gaslighting Julian specialized in to know that confrontation without proof would only hand him the narrative. The hysterical wife, the paranoid accusation, the apology tour that would buy him 6 more months of the exact same behavior with better cover stories. So instead, I called my grandfather. I hadn't spoken to him about anything real in years. Our relationship had cooled after I married into a family he distrusted from the first handshake. But he answered on the second ring, like he'd been waiting 9 years for that exact phone call. "Tell me everything," he'd said. And I did. Within a week, he'd hired a private investigator named Marcus Doyle, a quiet, careful man who documented 6 weeks of Julian's movements with a thoroughness that turned my stomach. Hotel check-ins, restaurant reservations for 2 under names that weren't mine, a pattern that had clearly been running far longer than I'd let myself see. I met with a divorce attorney under an assumed appointment name. I began, very slowly, moving money my grandfather quietly wired into an account Julian didn't know existed into somewhere he'd never think to look. And 3 weeks before that final party, while Julian slept off too much wine beside me, I slipped out of bed, crossed to his study, and opened a safe I wasn't supposed to know the combination to. A 6-digit code that turned out to be his mother's birthday. The one small piece of sentiment I don't think he even knew he'd left exposed. I photographed everything inside it. Encrypted files, offshore account numbers, a ledger of shell companies nested inside one another like something built specifically to survive an audit. I sent it all to my grandfather without asking a single question about what he intended to do with it. I trusted him completely. And it turned out that trust was the single best decision of my entire adult life. The SUV pulled up outside Renata's office building, glass and steel rising 40 stories above Park Avenue. "We're here," she said, closing the folder. "I want you to understand something before we walk in. Julian is going to lose everything. His freedom, his fortune, his name. The only real question left is how much of that wreckage lands on you and Theo before this is over. My job is to make sure the answer is none of it." "Then let's go make sure of it," I said, and stepped out of the car. The next 6 weeks blurred together into a single long stretch of depositions, filings, and hallway waiting rooms with bad coffee. I gave my statement to Detective Alvarez on a Tuesday morning, sitting across a metal table while a recorder blinked red between us, walking him through every version of the truth I had. By Thursday, the forged emails Julian's attorneys had submitted were formally thrown out, and the assistant who'd created them on his instruction flipped for a reduced sentence, testifying that Julian had promised her a signing bonus at a rival firm if she'd fabricate a paper trail implicating me. It was, Renata told me afterward, with something close to satisfaction in her voice, the single stupidest decision a man under federal indictment could possibly make, attempting witness tampering while out on a bail he'd eventually lose anyway. The custody hearing came at the end of that stretch, in a courtroom on Center Street, with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look faintly ill. Julian appeared via video link from a detention facility upstate, his suit still sharp even behind plexiglass, his lawyer doing the talking for him. He wanted supervised visitation. He wanted, his attorney argued with a straight face, to maintain a relationship with his son despite the circumstances. Renata stood and, without raising her voice once, laid out the case. The affair, documented across 6 weeks by a licensed investigator. The insurance policy taken out on my life 11 days before the arrest, with Julian as sole beneficiary. The attempted witness tampering. The pattern of financial control that had left me without independent access to funds for the last 2 years of the marriage. The judge, a woman with silver hair and no patience for theatrics, listened without interrupting, then granted me sole legal and physical custody, with no visitation, supervised or otherwise, pending the outcome of the criminal trial and, likely, well beyond it. Julian's face didn't change on the video feed. That was the thing about him I'd learned to recognize over 6 years. He never looked defeated, even when he'd lost completely. He simply recalculated, already 3 moves ahead toward whatever angle he thought might still work. It didn't matter. I walked out of that courtroom with my son legally, permanently mine, and I didn't look back at the screen once. Desmond Calloway died 11 days later. The heart episode from the night of the arrest had never fully resolved, and a second one finished what the first had started. Alone in a hospital room, with a security detail posted outside the door, because the SEC still considered him a flight risk, even unconscious. I felt, when my mother called to tell me, almost nothing at all. Not grief, not relief, just the strange flatness of hearing that a storm you'd already outrun had finally blown itself out somewhere behind you. Vanessa Cole was indicted 2 weeks after that, charged as a co-conspirator for her role funneling falsified deal documents through the fund's compliance department in exchange for a cut she'd been quietly banking in an account under her sister's name. The photographs of her being walked out of a federal building in handcuffs, the same red coat she'd worn to a dozen of our parties draped over her shoulders, made the front page of 3 different papers. I didn't feel triumphant looking at them. I felt, if anything, a kind of tired pity for a woman who'd traded whatever she'd once wanted for herself for a seat beside a man who was always going to burn everyone standing too close to him. My grandfather's health began to slip that winter. Quietly at first, a cough that lingered too long, a tiredness he tried to explain away as the season. By February, the doctors were using words like advanced and palliative, and I moved back into the city permanently, splitting my days between his hospital room and the offices of Whitlock Holdings, where he insisted, against every doctor's advice, on continuing to run board meetings from a laptop propped on a hospital tray. "You need to learn this now," he told me one afternoon in March, an IV line taped to the back of his hand, a stack of quarterly reports spread across his blanket like he was still 40 years younger and sitting behind his mahogany desk. "Not because I'm dying, because you're ready, and I don't want you finding that out the hard way, the way I had to." "You're not dying," I said, "the way you say things you know aren't true, because saying the true thing out loud feels like giving up too early." He smiled at me, tired but entirely unbothered. "Everyone dies, Vivian. The only real question is whether you've built something worth leaving behind when you go. I have, and so will you." He tapped the folder on his lap. "Now, tell me what you'd do differently about the Meridian portfolio if it were yours tomorrow." We spent that spring like that. Long afternoons walking through decades of decisions he'd made, the good ones and the ones he regretted, teaching me not just the mechanics of running an empire, but the temperament it required, the particular patience of playing a game measured in decades instead of quarters. He died in April, on a Tuesday, with my mother on one side of the bed and me on the other. Theo asleep in a stroller by the window because my grandfather had insisted, in his last lucid week, that his great-grandson be somewhere in the building when it happened. His last words to me, murmured somewhere between sleep and waking, were simple. "You never needed me to make you strong. You only needed to stop apologizing for already being it." The board named me interim CEO of Whitlock Holdings 4 days after the funeral. A formality more than a decision. The company charter had been quietly rewritten 2 years earlier, I later learned, naming me as sole heir to both the company and my grandfather's controlling shares. A plan he'd set in motion the same week Julian and I got engaged, when he'd taken one look at my fiancé across a dinner table and decided, privately, to build a parachute I wouldn't need for years. I was 31 years old, a widow of a marriage rather than a husband, sitting at the head of a 100-year-old shipping and finance empire, with a 9-month-old son on my hip during the first board meeting I ever chaired, because the nanny had a family emergency and I refused to reschedule anything else that month. Nobody in that boardroom said a word about it. I noticed, for the first time in years, that nobody dared to. The trial itself took 11 months to reach a verdict, dragged out by Julian's legal team through every delay tactic available to a man with nothing left to lose and no reason to hurry toward a sentence he already knew was coming. I testified twice, once for the prosecution, laying out the timeline of the affair and the insurance policy in a flat, rehearsed voice that Renata had drilled with me for weeks, so nothing in my delivery could be read as vindictive. Once more, briefly, when his defense attempted to argue that our marriage's collapse had somehow destabilized him into making poor financial decisions. A defense so absurd that even the judge's expression flickered with something close to disbelief. The jury took 4 hours to convict him on all 19 counts. I wasn't in the courtroom for the verdict. Renata called me from the courthouse steps while I sat on the floor of Theo's nursery, building a tower out of wooden blocks that he was gleefully determined to demolish the second I finished it. 22 years, she told me. No parole eligibility before 18. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment, watching my son knock the tower flat and shriek with laughter at the wreckage. Okay, I said. And I remember being a little surprised by how little the number moved through me. Not nothing. Some part of me would always carry the 6 years he'd taken, the version of myself I might have been if I'd never crossed his path at a fundraiser I almost hadn't attended. But no triumph either. Just the quiet, settled feeling of a door closing on a room I no longer needed to walk back into. The divorce itself was finalized 2 months after the verdict. A formality by then, since the criminal proceedings had already dismantled every argument his side might have made about assets or custody. I kept the Whitlock name legally as well as professionally that same year, dropping Calloway from every document that still carried it, and felt, signing the final page, a lightness I hadn't expected. Like setting down a bag I'd been carrying for so long, I'd forgotten it wasn't simply part of my own weight. I threw myself into the company that year in a way I hadn't let myself throw myself into anything since architecture school. I restructured 2 divisions that had grown bloated and directionless under my grandfather's later, more distracted years. I sold off a logistics subsidiary that had been quietly profiting from labor practices I couldn't stomach once I actually read the audit reports, and reinvested the proceeds into renewable shipping infrastructure that the board initially resisted and eventually, 3 years later, credited with saving the company an enormous amount in fuel costs it would otherwise have bled straight into a volatile oil market. But it was the foundation that mattered most to me. The thing I built not because a board expected it, but because some part of me needed somewhere to put 6 years of silence. I established the Whitlock Foundation in my grandfather's name that autumn, dedicating its first and largest grant to opening a shelter in Lower Manhattan for women and children fleeing domestic and financial abuse. Because by then I understood, in a way I hadn't fully understood while I was living it, that what Julian had done to me for 6 years wasn't really about affairs or money at all. It was about control, applied so gradually and so completely that I'd nearly forgotten what it felt like to make a decision that was entirely my own. We named the shelter Harbor House. I attended the ribbon cutting with Theo on my hip, watching him reach for the oversized ceremonial scissors with the single-minded fury only a toddler can bring to an object he isn't allowed to have, and thought, standing there in front of a building full of glass and light and rooms that would hold women I would never meet through the worst weeks of their lives, that it was the first thing I'd built entirely for someone other than myself since I'd walked out of that penthouse. I met Daniel Ferris the following spring at a fundraising gala for the foundation, of all places, a setting so similar to the one I'd walked out of 2 years earlier that I nearly laughed out loud when I realized it. He was an architect, unsurprisingly, brought in to consult on the shelter's second location, and he found me the way I'd once found staircases more interesting than the men circling the bar. Except this time, it was Daniel doing the finding, drawn not by any performance I was putting on, but by an offhand comment I'd made about a load-bearing wall someone had clearly gotten wrong in the renderings. "You're an architect," he said, more statement than question, holding 2 glasses of wine he'd apparently collected specifically to have an excuse to cross the room. I was, a long time ago, before other things got in the way. Nothing that got in the way looks particularly permanent to me. He handed me one of the glasses. You could always start again. I didn't fall for him quickly, and I was grateful, afterward, that I hadn't. He was patient in a way I didn't fully trust for the first several months, careful never to push past whatever pace I set, never once making me feel like his interest came with an invoice attached. He asked about Theo before he ever asked about the company. And when Theo, 18 months old by then and deeply suspicious of any man who came near his mother, threw a bowl of applesauce directly at Daniel's shirt during their second meeting, Daniel laughed so hard he had to sit down, and something in my chest loosened that I hadn't realized was still clenched tight. It took me nearly a year to let him all the way in. I told him about Julian in pieces, over many months, never all at once, watching his face carefully each time for the flicker of impatience or the subtle recalculation I'd learned to detect in Julian within the first year of our marriage. It never came. Daniel simply listened, and when I finished each piece, he'd usually just say something like, "That must have been exhausting to carry alone for so long," which was, somehow, exactly the right thing to say every single time. "You're allowed to just be happy, you know," my mother told me once, watching Daniel chase Theo around the lawn at the Nantucket house one August afternoon, both of them shrieking with a joy that had nothing performative in it at all. "You don't have to keep waiting for the other shoe." I know. Do you? I watched Daniel scoop Theo up onto his shoulders, both of them laughing at something only they understood, and felt the answer settle in my chest before I'd even fully worked it out in words. "I'm starting to," I said. Daniel proposed on a Tuesday, which he later admitted was entirely deliberate. He wanted to prove to me that ordinary days could hold extraordinary things too, that a life didn't need a chandelier full of hidden cameras and a countdown to a getaway car to matter. We were on the deck of the Nantucket house, Theo 3 years old by then and already asleep upstairs, the ring a plain band he'd had made from a piece of his grandmother's jewelry, rather than anything flashy, because he'd listened, over 2 years, to every quiet thing I'd said about what diamonds had come to mean to me. "I'm not going to promise you a life without hard days," he said, kneeling there on the same weathered planks where my mother had once told me crying was for funerals, not victories. "I'm just going to promise you I'll still be here on the hard ones. That's really all I've got." "That's more than I ever had before," I told him, and meant it completely, and said yes before he'd even fully finished getting the box open. We married the following June in the garden behind the house, small and unglamorous by the standards of the world I'd grown up in. No red dresses, no chandeliers, no cameras hidden anywhere. Theo, 4 by then, served as ring-bearer and took the job with a solemnity that made half the guests cry before the ceremony had even properly started. My mother gave a toast that managed to be both hilarious and devastating in the same 3 minutes. I danced with Daniel under string lights my grandfather would have thought were far too modest for a Whitlock wedding, and I remember thinking somewhere in the middle of that dance that he would have loved this version far more than he ever would have admitted. Julian sent one letter that year, the only communication I ever received from him after the trial. I nearly threw it away unopened, recognizing the prison return address before I'd even registered the rest of the envelope. But something, curiosity maybe, or the simple desire to see whether the man I'd once loved had learned anything at all in captivity, made me open it instead. Vivian, I know you'll probably never read this, and I know if you do, you'll never forgive me for any of it, but I need to write it down anyway. Solitary gives a man a lot of hours to think, more than I ever gave myself the chance to think in 6 years of running from one deal to the next. I was a monster to you. I know that now, sitting in a cell with nothing to distract me from finally seeing it clearly. I treated you like something I owned instead of someone I married. I never once saw your strength or your intelligence or the fact that you were building an entire architecture career I actively discouraged because it made me feel small that you had something that was entirely yours. I was blind. And worse than blind, I think some part of me knew exactly what I was doing and did it anyway because it was easier than being a better man. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't think I've earned the right to ask for it. But I wanted you to know that I'm sorry, more than I have the words to explain properly in a letter this short. I hope Theo grows up nothing like me. I hope you find every good thing I was too stupid and too selfish to give you while I had the chance. Goodbye, Vivian. I read it twice, sitting alone in the study that had once been my grandfather's, and then I carried it to the fireplace and watched it burn down to ash without feeling much of anything at all. Not anger, not sadness, not the closure people always promise you'll feel in moments like that. He was simply a chapter that had ended, a lesson I'd already learned and carried forward into a life he no longer had any part in. The company grew steadily through those years, in a way that surprised even the board members who'd initially doubted a 31-year-old widow with an infant could steer a 100-year-old empire. We expanded into 3 new markets across 2 continents. The renewable shipping initiative I'd pushed through against significant early resistance became, within 4 years, the division analysts cited most often when explaining why Whitlock Holdings had weathered a volatile decade better than nearly any of its competitors. Harbor House expanded from 1 shelter into a network of 6 across the tri-state area, and the foundation's annual grant budget grew large enough that I hired a full-time director, a former social worker named Priya Nandan, to run it properly instead of squeezing it in around board meetings. Theo started kindergarten the same week we opened the 4th Harbor House location, and I remember standing in the schoolyard on his first day, watching him march toward the building with a backpack nearly as big as he was, thinking about how completely different this version of his childhood looked from the one I'd been so afraid, on that first night in the town car, that he might inherit instead. "You okay?" Daniel asked, his hand finding mine. "I'm better than okay," I said, and watched our son disappear through the doors without a single backward glance, already brave in a way that had nothing to do with anything I'd taught him, and everything to do with simply never having learned to be afraid in the first place. The first time Theo asked about his father, he was 6, and the question arrived with the particular bluntness only children manage, dropped into the middle of an otherwise ordinary Tuesday dinner like it weighed nothing at all. "Where's my other dad?" Daniel and I exchanged a glance across the table. We'd talked about this moment for years in the abstract, rehearsed a dozen versions of an answer that would be honest without being cruel. But nothing quite prepares you for a 6-year-old's face waiting patiently for the truth over a plate of macaroni. "Your biological father made some very bad choices," I said carefully, choosing each word the way I'd once chosen words for a boardroom. "He hurt a lot of people, including me, and he's living somewhere far away because of it, somewhere he can't hurt anyone else." Is he going to come find us? No, I said, and made sure my voice carried enough certainty that he could borrow it if he needed to. He can't, and even if he could, I would never let him anywhere near you. That's a promise, not just something I'm saying to make you feel better. He considered this with the grave seriousness 6-year-olds bring to enormous questions, poking at his macaroni. Okay, he finally said. Daddy Daniel's my real dad anyway. He's the one who does everything. Something in my chest that had been braced for months finally unclenched all at once. Daniel reached over and ruffled Theo's hair, his eyes suspiciously bright, and neither of us said anything else about it that night, because there was nothing left that needed saying. It wasn't the last conversation we had about Julian. There were more over the years, deeper and more complicated, as Theo grew old enough to understand nuance, to ask harder questions about why some people simply choose to be cruel, when kindness would have cost them nothing. But that first conversation set the tone for all the ones that followed. Honest, unafraid, never once pretending his father hadn't existed, but never once letting that existence define what kind of man Theo himself would grow up to be. Daniel and I had our own hard year, 2 years into the marriage, though it looked nothing like the hard years I'd survived before him. It wasn't infidelity or cruelty. It was something quieter and, in its own way, harder to name. He'd given up a growing independent practice to consult almost exclusively for the foundation, and somewhere in year 2, he admitted, late one night after too much wine, that he sometimes felt like a footnote in his own life, introduced at every gala as Vivian Whitlock's husband, before anyone bothered asking what he actually did. I didn't marry you to disappear into your name, he said, and I heard, underneath the words, an old fear I recognized instantly because I'd lived inside a version of it myself for 6 years. The particular erosion of being slowly reduced to someone else's footnote. I didn't get defensive, which surprised even me. I listened, the way he'd always listened to me. And then I did something that took more courage than I expected it to. I stepped back from 3 board seats I didn't need to personally hold and used the freed up time to help him relaunch his own firm under his own name, quietly funding the first 2 years of overhead through a personal investment that had absolutely nothing to do with Whitlock Holdings, structured specifically so no headline could ever attach my name to his success. His firm designed the 6th Harbor House location entirely on its own merit 2 years later, and when the building won a regional design award, the acceptance speech he gave never once mentioned my last name. I sat in the audience and cried anyway, proud in a way that had nothing to do with anything I'd built myself. Vanessa Cole was released on parole the same autumn, after serving 4 years of a 7-year sentence for her role in the fraud. I read about it in a 2-paragraph item buried on page 11 of the business section. No photograph this time, no red dress. Just a name I hadn't thought about in years, attached to a sentence about supervised release and a 5-year probation period. I felt, reading it, a strange and unexpected flicker of something almost like pity for a woman who'd traded whatever she might have built for herself on her own merit for a handful of years standing beside a man who was always going to burn everyone who got close enough to warm themselves by him. I ran into Patricia Lowell at a charity auction that same year, older now, her husband's fund having quietly folded 2 years after the scandal broke, when investors, spooked by proximity to the Callaway name, pulled out en masse. She approached me with none of the sharpness I remembered from that penthouse party, her diamond bracelet notably absent, her smile smaller and, for the first time in the years I'd known her, entirely without an edge. Vivienne, she said, I owe you an apology, I think, for a lot of things I said back then. You don't owe me anything, Patricia. I think I do. I spent years measuring my worth by whether my husband still wanted me in the room. Watching you build all this, she gestured vaguely at the gala around us, at the foundation banner hanging behind the stage, made me realize how small that measurement really was. I didn't hold a grudge against her, not really. She'd been cruel out of her own fear, the way frightened people so often are, and I understood that fear better than most. It's a hard thing to unlearn, I told her. Took me most of a marriage to unlearn it myself. She nodded, and we didn't become close friends after that, exactly. But we stopped being anything close to enemies either. And sometimes that's its own quiet kind of victory. I went back to architecture properly the year Theo turned 8. Not as a hobby squeezed between board meetings, but as something I finally let myself claim as mine again. It started small. Sketches in the margins of quarterly reports, late nights at the kitchen table after Theo was asleep, Daniel looking over my shoulder at drawings I'd been too afraid to show anyone since graduate school. Eventually, he stopped looking over my shoulder and started handing me actual projects instead. Small ones at first. A renovation of the 3rd Harbor House location that needed a designer who understood trauma-informed spaces from the inside, not just from a textbook. I designed that renovation myself. Every hallway and window placement considered against the specific fear I remembered from standing in my own kitchen 7 years earlier, wondering if anyone in that glittering party would notice if I simply disappeared. I wanted the women who walked through Harbor House's doors to feel something I hadn't felt for most of my marriage. Safety that didn't have to be earned or performed. Light that came from windows placed high enough to let sun in without ever making anyone visible to the street. The building won a design award the following spring, the first one that had my own name on it in over a decade, and I stood at the podium accepting it with a strange, unfamiliar joy that had nothing to do with fraud verdicts or custody hearings or any of the things I'd spent years being strong about. It was simply the joy of having built something beautiful with my own 2 hands again. And I hadn't realized, until I felt it, exactly how much I'd missed it. Our daughter, Grace, was born the following winter, arriving 3 weeks early on a Tuesday during an ice storm that nearly stranded Daniel at his office across town. She had my mother's sharp gray eyes from the very first day, wide open and appraising everything in the delivery room like she'd already decided the world owed her a full explanation. Theo, 9 by then, held her for the first time with the exaggerated care of a boy terrified of dropping something enormously precious, and announced, with total conviction, that he intended to teach her everything he knew about dinosaurs the moment she could walk. "You're not worried, having a girl?" my mother asked me quietly that first night, watching Daniel walk Grace slowly around the hospital room to soothe her. I understood the question immediately. The old ghost of Desmond's voice in that kitchen doorway. The useless little girl who grew up just like her mother. Words I hadn't thought about in years, but that apparently still lived somewhere in the back of both our minds. "No," I said. "I'm not worried at all. If she grows up anything like her mother, she's going to be just fine." The hostile takeover attempt at Whitlock Holdings came 2 years after that, orchestrated by a private equity firm that had been quietly buying up shares for the better part of a year before making its intentions public in a filing that landed on my desk on an otherwise unremarkable Thursday. The firm's principal, a man named Gordon Ashby, whose reputation for gutting family companies preceded him by a decade, made no secret of his plan to break Whitlock Holdings into pieces and sell off the shipping and foundation funding divisions he considered dead weight against the more profitable finance arm. I fought it for 4 months, calling in relationships my grandfather had spent 50 years building, personally flying to meet with institutional shareholders I'd never had reason to court directly before, staying up past midnight with Renata Cruz, retained now as the company's permanent general counsel, building a defense that relied as much on the foundation's public goodwill as on the balance sheet itself. In the end, we won by a margin narrow enough that I didn't fully exhale until the final proxy vote was certified. But we won, and Gordon Ashby's firm quietly liquidated its position and moved on to easier targets within the year. "Your grandfather would have loved watching you do that," my mother told me afterward, over the kind of celebratory dinner we'd started having whenever the company survived something that could have ended it. I think he'd have been annoyed I let it get that close before fighting back. He'd have been annoyed and proud in exactly equal measure. That was always his particular gift. She raised her glass. To surviving the things that try to break you apart. I raised mine back, thinking about a chandelier full of hidden cameras and a town car idling at the curb, and a man who had watched his granddaughter walk out of a marriage with her chin up and understood, finally, in a way I hadn't quite understood before, exactly how much of his patience and his particular kind of quiet ferocity I'd inherited along with everything else. Theo's 14th year was the one where the questions stopped being simple. He came home from school one afternoon with a printout from a class project on financial crime. His history teacher had apparently used the Callaway fraud case as a real-world example without realizing, or perhaps realizing perfectly well, that one of her students shared the name of the man at the center of it, and set it on the kitchen counter without a word, waiting for me to notice. I sat down across from him instead of reaching for the paper right away. "You want to talk about it?" I already knew the basics, but I didn't know it was $380 million. I didn't know he tried to blame it on you. His jaw was tight in a way that reminded me, uncomfortably, of Julian's own jaw the night of that final party, though the resemblance ended there, where Julian's tension had always curdled into cruelty. Theo's simply looked like grief for a version of a father he'd never had and, by then, had stopped wanting. "He did try to blame it on me," I said. "It didn't work because the evidence was solid, and because I never once did anything wrong that he could actually prove. But he tried." "Why didn't you ever tell me that part?" "Because you were 7 when it happened. And there's a difference between honesty and handing a 7-year-old more weight than he needs to carry. I always planned to tell you the rest when you were old enough to actually hold it." I reached across the counter and covered his hand with mine. "You're old enough now, if you want the rest of it." He did want the rest of it, and we spent that evening at the kitchen table with Daniel quietly making dinner in the background, me walking my son through the whole of it, the receipt in the jacket pocket, the private investigator, the safe I wasn't supposed to know the combination to, the town car and the news banner and the insurance policy that had priced my life at $2 million. He listened without interrupting, the way Daniel always listened, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I want to be a lawyer," he finally said, apropos of nothing and everything at once. "Like Renata, I want to be the person on the other side of the table from guys like him." "That's a good reason to want it," I said. "Not the only reason people become lawyers, but a good one." He held on to that ambition through the rest of high school with a steadiness that reminded me, more than once, of my grandfather's particular brand of patience, the willingness to build something across years instead of demanding it arrive all at once. Renata took an interest in him that went beyond professional courtesy, letting him shadow her office during 2 separate summers, walking him through the mechanics of a deposition, the careful architecture of a cross-examination, the discipline required to stay calm in a room where someone was actively trying to provoke you into a mistake. He's sharper than you were at his age, she told me once, watching him through the glass wall of a conference room, deep in concentration over a mock case file she'd assigned him for practice. You had the instincts, but you were still learning to trust them. He already trusts his. Good, I said. I want him to have an easier time trusting himself than I did. We opened the first International Harbor House location the same year Theo started his college applications, a shelter in Manchester built in partnership with a British nonprofit that had spent a decade trying to secure the kind of funding the foundation could now provide almost as a matter of course. I flew out for the opening myself, Grace in tow, 6 years old by then, fiercely opinionated, already showing an early and alarming talent for negotiation that Daniel swore she'd inherited directly from me, and stood at the ribbon cutting thinking about how far the distance really was between a kitchen counter in a penthouse I no longer owned and a converted textile mill on the other side of an ocean, now full of light and safety for women who would never know my name, but would, I hoped, feel something of what I'd built it to give them. Would you have believed this back then? Daniel asked me quietly, watching Grace attempt to commandeer the ceremonial scissors from the mayor's assistant. Not for a second, I said. Back then, I would have believed I was lucky to survive the night. Everything past that felt like more than I had any right to ask for. And now? I watched my daughter finally win her negotiation and cut the ribbon herself, grinning up at a room full of strangers applauding a 6-year-old like she'd single-handedly built the place. Now I think I built exactly what I was always capable of building. It just took someone finally getting out of the way long enough to let me try. Julian died in prison the winter Theo turned 17. A heart condition that had apparently been developing for years, undiagnosed and untreated in the particular way medical care inside federal facilities so often fails the people it's meant to serve. I learned about it from a brief phone call from a prison chaplain, obligated by some administrative protocol to notify next of kin, even though our divorce had been finalized more than a decade earlier, and Theo's custody had never once included visitation. I told Theo myself, sitting with him on the back deck of the Nantucket house where so much of this story had, in one way or another, already unfolded. He took the news with a complicated stillness, not grief exactly, but something adjacent to it, the mourning of a father he'd never actually had rather than the one who'd died. I don't know how I'm supposed to feel, he admitted. You're not supposed to feel anything specific, I told him. Whatever you actually feel is the right thing to feel. There's no test here, and nobody's grading the answer. He was quiet for a long time, watching the water. I think I just feel like it's finished. Like a book closing that I already stopped reading a long time ago. That's about exactly how I felt too, the day his letter arrived, I said. For what it's worth. We sat together until the sun went down, and neither of us cried. And I don't think either of us needed to. Theo got into 3 law schools the following spring, and chose, in the end, the one closest to home. A decision he framed to his college advisor as purely strategic, and admitted to me privately was really about not wanting to be too far from Grace during her own difficult teenage years. A kindness so quietly generous it nearly undid me the moment he said it out loud. You don't have to stay close for her, I told him. She'll survive you going wherever you need to go. I know she would. I want to stay close anyway. That's different. He shrugged, looking so much like Daniel in that particular gesture that I sometimes forgot, for whole stretches of time, that Daniel wasn't his biological father at all. Besides, I like this city. I like the firm I want to eventually work at. And I like being close enough to steal Sunday dinners whenever I want them. He started law school that autumn, and I watched him walk into orientation with the same steady, unhurried confidence I'd once watched him walk into kindergarten with. No longer a small boy with a backpack too big for him, but a young man who had, somewhere along the way, become entirely his own person, shaped by everything that had happened before he was old enough to remember it, but never once defined by it the way I'd feared, in the darkest hours of that first year, that he might be. Grace, meanwhile, was busy becoming a force of nature in her own right. 13 now, and already the kind of student who argued with her teachers not out of disrespect, but out of a genuine, restless conviction that most things could be explained better than they currently were being explained. She'd inherited, somewhere along the genetic line, an interest in architecture that had skipped straight past Daniel's careful technical precision and landed instead on something closer to my own early instincts. She cared less about load-bearing calculations and more about how a room made a person feel the moment they walked into it. An instinct I recognized instantly because it was the exact instinct that had first pulled me toward a cantilevered staircase at a fundraiser I'd almost skipped 20-some years earlier. "You're going to steal my whole career someday," I told her once, watching her sketch an elaborate, wildly impractical treehouse design across the back of her math homework. "I'm going to have my own career," she said, with the particular bluntness she'd clearly inherited from my mother. "I'm just going to be better at the parts you're bad at." "Which parts am I bad at?" "You always make the entrances too formal. People should feel like they're allowed to just walk in, not like they need an invitation." She held up the sketch, genuinely proud of it. "Look, no front door, just an open side, like the house is already inviting you before you even decide to come." I looked at that ridiculous, brilliant, structurally impossible treehouse sketch and thought, not for the first time, that whatever else Julian Calloway had taken from me across 6 years of marriage, he had never once managed to touch the parts of myself I'd eventually pass down to 2 children who understood, instinctively, and without ever needing to be taught it directly, that the things worth building were the ones that made people feel welcome, rather than watched. The Whitlock Foundation opened its 20th Harbor House location the year I turned 45, a milestone I marked less through any personal celebration and more through a quiet afternoon reviewing intake numbers with Priya Nandan, over 11,000 women and children who had passed through the network's doors in the years since that first ribbon cutting. Each one a life that had, in some small or enormous way, been given room to become something other than what it had been trapped inside of. "Your grandfather would be unbearable about this, you know," Priya told me, sliding the annual report across the table. "He'd have found some way to take credit for the whole thing." "He probably would have," I agreed, laughing despite myself. "In fairness, he did leave me the money that started it." "He left you the money. You built everything it turned into." She tapped the number on the front page. "Don't let him take credit for the part that was actually you." I thought about that conversation for a long time afterward, turning it over the way you turn over something you already half believe, but have never quite let yourself say out loud. My grandfather had given me the tools, the money, the evidence, the lawyer, the plane fueled and waiting on a tarmac. But the walk down the hallway with my son in my arms, the 6 years of silence I'd endured before I ever found the courage to break it, the choice to stay and fight instead of disappearing somewhere no one would ever find me, those had never belonged to anyone but me. Teo graduated law school the spring I turned 48, near the top of his class, with 3 firm offers waiting before he'd even finished his final exams, including, to my quiet and enormous pride, an offer from Renata Cruz's own firm, which by then had grown from her single-woman practice into one of the city's most respected boutique litigation shops. He took it without hesitation, and I sat in the audience at his graduation ceremony with Daniel's hand in mine and Grace, 17 now and taller than I was, leaning against my shoulder, watching my son walk across the stage to accept a diploma that represented, in ways none of the other families in that auditorium could possibly understand, an entire childhood built deliberately in the opposite direction of the one his biological father had tried to hand him. Doctor of Jurisprudence Theodore Whitlock, the dean announced, and I felt something crack open in my chest at the sound of that name. Not Calloway, never Calloway. A decision I'd made the same week the divorce was finalized, and one Theo himself had confirmed, at 18, that he wanted to keep permanently, rather than reclaim any piece of his father's name once he was old enough to choose for himself. He found us in the crowd afterward, diploma still in hand, and hugged me hard enough to lift me slightly off the ground, the way he'd been doing since he'd first gotten taller than me somewhere around 15. "We did it," he said. "You did it. I just kept the lights on." "You did a lot more than keep the lights on, Mom." He pulled back, grinning, looking so much like the 8-month-old baby I'd once carried out of a party in the middle of the worst night of my life, that for a moment, the two images overlapped completely in my mind, past and present folding into each other. "I'm going to spend my whole career going after guys exactly like him. You know that, right?" "I know. I've known since you were 14 and told me the same thing at the kitchen counter." "Good," he said. "Just wanted to make sure the plan was still on record." I began designing more ambitiously in the years that followed, once Grace was old enough that I no longer needed to schedule my creative work around school pickups and homework crises. I took on a commission for a public library in Queens, then a community center in the Bronx, funded partly through the foundation and partly through a municipal grant I'd spent 8 months lobbying for personally. Then, finally, a project that felt like it closed some long, slow circle I hadn't fully realized I was still walking. A redesign of the very fundraiser venue where I'd first met Julian Calloway 26 years earlier. A building whose owners had approached me specifically because of the reputation Harbor House's architecture had built for me across a decade of careful, deliberate, trauma-informed design. I stood in that ballroom during the final walkthrough, the space gutted down to its bones, sunlight pouring through windows I'd insisted be enlarged, and thought about a 24-year-old woman standing near a cantilevered staircase, more interested in the building than in any of the men circling the bar, who had no idea yet what the next 26 years were going to cost her, or what they were eventually going to give back. "You okay?" the project manager asked, noticing me standing still in the middle of the empty room. "I'm better than okay," I said, echoing words I'd said to Daniel once, years earlier, standing in a schoolyard watching our son march bravely toward a set of doors. "I'm just remembering something." The American Institute of Architects called the following winter to inform me I'd been selected for their Lifetime Achievement Award, an honor I initially assumed was some kind of administrative error, given that I'd spent the first half of my career almost entirely absent from the profession, raising a son and running a company and building a foundation instead of designing buildings full-time. The committee chair, when I called to double-check, laughed and told me the award existed specifically for architects whose impact extended well beyond blueprints, and that mine, in her words, extended about as far as any body of work she'd reviewed in 20 years on the committee. I flew to Los Angeles for the ceremony that spring, Daniel and both children in tow, my mother insisting on coming as well, despite being 73 and openly unimpressed by air travel. "Theo," 30 by then, a rising litigator with a reputation for taking apart financial fraud cases with a precision his old mentor Renata still bragged about at every opportunity, sat in the front row beside his sister, who'd just finished her second year of her own architecture program and had spent the entire flight out sketching the convention center's exterior from memory before we'd even landed. The ballroom was packed. Colleagues, competitors, admirers, several hundred people who had spent careers building the kind of things I'd only recently allowed myself to fully return to. I walked to the podium in low heels my younger self would have considered scandalously practical for an event this important, my hair streaked with gray I'd stopped bothering to hide years earlier, and looked out over a room that had absolutely no idea what any of this had actually cost, or what it had ultimately been worth. There was a woman named Corinne who came through the very first Harbor House location during its second year of operation. And though the foundation eventually helped thousands of women whose names and faces blurred together in my memory the way any large body of work eventually does, Corinne was the one I never forgot. Because she was the first, and because something about her situation had cut close enough to my own that I'd found myself unable to keep the professional distance the staff always encouraged founders to maintain. She arrived on a Sunday night with 2 children and a garbage bag of clothes, having left a husband who ran a mid-sized investment firm in Connecticut and had spent 9 years slowly siphoning her name off every account, every deed, every piece of paper that might have given her any independent leverage if she ever tried to leave. By the time she found her way to Harbor House, she had $11 in cash, no credit in her own name, and a restraining order she wasn't yet sure she had the legal standing to enforce. I met her during one of my early, unannounced visits, back before board obligations made those visits rarer than I would have liked. She was sitting in the shelter's small library room, reading to her younger daughter, and when the staff introduced me as the foundation's founder, she looked at me with an expression I recognized instantly, because I'd worn it myself once. The particular exhausted disbelief of a woman who has spent years being told she was imagining her own reality, finally standing in a room built specifically to tell her she hadn't been. "They said you used to be married to someone like him," she said, not quite a question. "I was." "How long did it take you to stop feeling like it was your fault?" I sat down across from her, and for once, I didn't reach for the careful, board-approved language the Foundation's communications team had drafted for exactly these moments. Honestly, longer than I want to admit. There are still days I catch myself doing it, assuming a business failure is somehow my fault before I even look at the numbers, apologizing for taking up space in a room I have every right to be in. It fades. It doesn't disappear completely, not for me, and it might not for you either. But it fades enough that eventually it stops running the show. She stayed at Harbor House for 4 months, working with the Foundation's legal partners to rebuild the financial paper trail her husband had spent 9 years dismantling, and eventually moved into her own apartment with both children, having secured a settlement large enough to give her actual footing rather than the illusion of it. I attended her daughter's high school graduation 7 years later at Corinne's personal invitation, sitting in a gymnasium in Connecticut, watching a girl who had once slept in a shelter's shared bunk room walk across a stage to accept a diploma, her mother sobbing openly in the row ahead of me. "You gave us the room to become this," Corinne told me afterward, hugging me hard enough that I nearly lost my footing. "I don't think you understand how much that actually means, from the inside of it." "I think I understand better than most people could," I told her, and meant it entirely. I told that story in careful, edited form at the awards ceremony in Los Angeles, standing at the podium, looking out over a room that had gathered to honor buildings, not people, but that had somehow, through the particular arc of my own career, ended up honoring both at once. 26 years ago, I began. I was a stay-at-home wife, standing in a kitchen at my own anniversary party, holding an 8-month-old son, listening to my husband humiliate me in front of 200 guests because he'd decided that was easier than admitting the marriage had already failed. I had no career at that point, no independent income, no plan beyond surviving the next several hours. If you had told me that night that I would eventually stand in a room like this one, accepting an award for a body of architectural work, I would not have believed you. And I don't think I would have had the imagination left to even try. The room had gone quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when people sense they're about to hear something they weren't expecting from an acceptance speech. Tonight, I want to talk less about buildings and more about rooms, because that's really what all of this work has been about, from the very beginning. A room can hold you like a cage, or it can hold you like a hand. I spent 6 years of my life inside rooms that were built deliberately to make me feel smaller than I actually was. And then I spent the next 26 years learning how to build rooms that did the opposite. Rooms with windows placed high enough to let in light without exposing anyone to a street they were still afraid of. Entrances designed to feel like an invitation instead of a test. Hallways wide enough that a woman carrying a child and a garbage bag of everything she owned could walk through them and, for the first time in longer than she could remember, feel like she was allowed to take up exactly as much space as she needed. I found Theo in the front row, 30 years old, watching me with an expression I recognized as the same one he'd worn at 8. Listening to me tell him the truth about his father across a kitchen table for the first time. I found Grace beside him, 20 years old, already sketching entrances in her sleep, already understanding instinctively what had taken me most of my adult life to fully articulate out loud. I found Daniel, who had never once needed me to be smaller than I was, and my mother, who had taught me that crying was for funerals and not for victories. Though I broke that rule slightly, standing at that podium, letting a few tears fall that I didn't bother wiping away. This shelter network, this body of design work, this entire second career I never expected to have, none of it exists because I was extraordinary. It exists because I was ordinary and hurt, and eventually angry enough to stop apologizing for taking up space in my own life. If any of you in this room have ever been told you're too much, too demanding, too difficult to keep, I would ask you to consider the possibility that you were simply occupying a room that was never built to hold the full size of who you actually are. Go build yourself a bigger one. I promise you, it can be done. The applause that followed lasted longer than any acceptance speech I'd ever watched from an audience seat, and I stood there at the podium for a moment before stepping back, letting it wash over me, thinking about a photograph I still kept framed on my desk at home. Myself at 31, walking out of a penthouse with a baby on my hip, my chin held high, a moment I'd captured almost by accident on a hallway security camera that my grandfather had insisted I keep a copy of, for reasons neither of us had fully articulated at the time. I understood the reason now, standing in that ballroom. Some moments deserve to be remembered exactly as they happened, before you know how the story ends, so that you can look back later and see the precise instant everything actually changed. That night, after the ballroom had emptied and the caterers had cleared the last of the tables, I sat on the balcony of our hotel room with a glass of wine, looking out over a city skyline that had never once been mine but felt, that particular evening, entirely welcoming anyway. Daniel joined me a few minutes later, 2 more glasses balanced carefully in one hand, and settled into the chair beside mine without a word, the comfortable kind of silence we'd built together over more than 2 decades of marriage. "Quite a speech," he finally said. "Thank you." "Did you mean all of it?" "Every word. I don't think I've ever meant anything more completely in my life." I turned to look at him, at the gray now threading through his hair, at the same patient warmth in his eyes that had first drawn me across a fundraiser 20 years earlier. "You've come a long way with me, you know. You didn't have to take on any of this. The company, the foundation, a kid who wasn't yours by blood, a wife who spent the first 2 years of the marriage flinching every time a door closed too hard." "I didn't take it on," he said. "I fell in love with a person, and everything that came with her came with her. That's not the same as a sacrifice, Vivian. It never was." "Are you happy?" I asked, and I meant it as a real question, not the kind you ask expecting a reflexive answer. He considered it properly, the way he considered everything, sipping his wine before he finally spoke. "I think I'm the happiest I've ever been in my life. I get to watch you build things that matter. I get to watch our kids grow up steady and brave. I get to fall asleep every night next to someone who fought harder for the life she has than almost anyone I've ever met." He reached over and took my hand. "Yes, I'm happy. Are you?" I thought about the question properly, too, about the whole arc of it, the penthouse and the town car and the courtroom and the hospital room where my grandfather had told me I never needed him to make me strong. About Corinne's daughter walking across a gymnasium stage, about Theo's diploma and Grace's impossible, beautiful treehouse sketches, about a body of design work that had finally, fully become mine again. "Yes," I said. "I'm happy. I think I finally actually am." "Good," he said, squeezing my hand. "That's really all I ever wanted for you." We sat there a long time, watching the lights of a city neither of us called home twinkle in the distance, not needing to say anything else at all. We flew back to New York the next morning, and Theo was waiting for us at the arrivals gate, despite having a full docket of depositions scheduled that same afternoon, because he'd told me years earlier, at 14, sitting at a kitchen counter absorbing the whole truth of his own history for the first time, that he intended to show up for the moments that mattered, and he had never once, in the decades since, failed to keep that particular promise to himself. "Congratulations, Mom," he said, folding me into a hug that lifted me slightly off my feet. "Thank you, sweetheart. Don't you have court this afternoon?" "I have time for this first. Some things matter more than a deposition." He pulled back, grinning, 30 years old and entirely his own person, carrying nothing of his biological father in him that I could ever find, no matter how carefully, in darker moments over the years, I had occasionally searched. "Besides, I learned from the best. Showing up when it counts. Isn't that basically the whole lesson?" "It's most of it," I agreed. We drove back into the city together, the four of us packed into one car the way we hadn't been in years, Grace narrating the entire skyline from the back seat, pointing out buildings she liked and buildings she thought she could have designed better, Theo arguing good-naturedly with her about the structural feasibility of at least 3 of her proposed improvements. I looked out the window at a city I had once nearly disappeared from entirely, at buildings I'd helped design and shelters I'd helped fund, and a life that had, against every odd that night in the penthouse had presented, turned out to be entirely, stubbornly worth staying for. I thought about Julian, buried now in a family plot upstate that neither Theo nor I had ever visited, his name reduced to a cautionary case study in a high school history classroom. I thought about Desmond, gone even longer, remembered by no one who mattered. I thought about my grandfather, gone from the world, but never once absent from any decision I'd made since. His particular blend of patience and quiet ferocity woven so completely into who I'd become that I sometimes forgot, for whole stretches of ordinary days, that he wasn't simply still there beside me, watching, unbearably proud. And I thought about myself, Vivian Whitlock, architect, mother, philanthropist, survivor of a marriage that had tried very hard to convince her she was smaller than she actually was, and had failed completely and permanently the moment she'd walked out of a penthouse with her chin held high and her son on her hip, and never once looked back. I had inherited more than money from that night. I had inherited the understanding that survival wasn't the end of the story, only the beginning of it. That the real work came after, in the slow, deliberate, decades-long process of building something worth the cost of what it had taken to get free enough to build it at all. Not every threat from the old life stayed buried as neatly as Julian and his father had. 3 years before the AIA ceremony, a man named Preston Dale, a former Callaway Capital compliance officer who had somehow avoided indictment during the original fraud investigation by testifying against Julian in exchange for immunity, resurfaced with a lawsuit claiming he was owed a share of the Whitlock fortune, arguing in a filing so audacious that even Renata laughed out loud reading it, that his cooperation with federal prosecutors had directly enabled my custody of Theo and my subsequent inheritance, and that he was therefore entitled to what his attorney termed a finder's fee. "This is either the boldest thing I've seen in 30 years of practice," Renata told me, sliding the filing across her desk, "or the stupidest. I genuinely can't decide which." "Can he actually win anything?" "No. Not $1, but he can drag it out for a year and cost us both a great deal of aggravation trying." She tapped the signature page. "He's betting you'll settle just to make him disappear. Men like him always bet that way, because it's worked for them before." I thought about it for exactly one evening, sitting with Daniel on the back deck of the Nantucket House, turning the decision over, the way my grandfather had taught me to turn over every decision that mattered. Not from the angle of what would be easiest, but from the angle of what would matter most in 10 years. "If I settle, it sets a precedent," I finally said. "Every opportunist who ever brushed up against that whole mess gets an incentive to come knocking. If I fight it, it costs more in the short term, but it closes the door permanently." "Then close the door," Daniel said simply. We fought it. Renata took Preston Dale's deposition personally, and within 2 hours had dismantled his entire theory of the case so thoroughly that his own attorney requested a recess to, in his words, reassess the viability of continuing. The suit was dismissed with prejudice 4 months later, and Preston Dale, whose name I never had to hear again after that year, quietly disappeared back into whatever obscurity he'd emerged from. "You handled that well," my mother told me when I finally told her the whole story over dinner. She was 71 that year, still sharp, still measuring the world with the same gray eyes I saw in the mirror every morning, though age had softened the edges of her in ways I hadn't fully expected. A gentleness creeping in that had never been available to her, I think, during the years she'd spent raising me largely on her own after my father's death. "I learned from you," I told her. "Don't apologize for fighting for what's yours. You taught me that before grandfather ever did." She smiled, pleased, and reached for my hand across the table the way she'd done so many mornings on that same deck years earlier, the morning after I'd walked out with Theo, telling me that crying was for funerals and not for victories. She died 4 years after that dinner, peacefully, in her sleep. in the same Nantucket house where she'd raised me and where I'd eventually raised my own children during every summer we could manage. I found her the next morning, having gone up to bring her coffee the way I did whenever we were both staying at the house together, and understood immediately, from the particular stillness of the room, before I'd even fully processed what I was looking at. I gave the eulogy myself, standing in the same garden where Daniel and I had married, in front of a small crowd of people who had known her across 7 decades, women from her book club, colleagues from the museum board she'd chaired for 15 years, the housekeeper who had worked for our family since before I was born, and who cried harder than anyone else in attendance. "My mother taught me that survival isn't dramatic," I said, looking out at the water beyond the garden, the same water she'd stood beside on countless mornings, coffee in hand, watching the sun come up over a life she'd rebuilt more than once herself, though she'd rarely spoken of the details. "It's not a single grand gesture. It's 1,000 small, unglamorous mornings where you get up anyway, make the coffee anyway, hold your daughter anyway, even when everything in you is exhausted from simply getting through the day before." She never once let me see her break, not because she wasn't allowed to, but because she wanted me to understand that breaking and ending are 2 entirely different things. She broke plenty in her life. She never once let it be the end of anything. Theo and Grace both spoke afterward, each of them sharing a version of their grandmother I recognized instantly and loved hearing described through their eyes. Theo's memory of her teaching him to sail off the same dock where he'd later teach Grace. Grace's memory of being handed a sketchbook at age 6 and told, in no uncertain terms, that a Whitlock woman built things rather than simply admiring them. We buried her beside my grandfather, in the small family plot on the edge of the property. The 2 headstones facing the water they'd both loved more than almost anywhere else on earth. I visited that plot every summer after that, usually alone, usually early in the morning before anyone else in the house was awake, standing there with my coffee the way she once had, telling them both, silently, about whatever the year had brought. The Harbor House expansions, the design awards, Theo's cases, Grace's sketches, Daniel's steady, unwavering presence through all of it. "You'd both be so unbearable about how well this all turned out," I told them, one particular morning the summer before the AIA ceremony, laughing quietly to myself in the empty garden. "I can practically hear you arguing over which one of you deserves more credit." The water didn't answer, obviously, but I like to think I heard something in the particular way the wind moved through the garden that morning. Not an answer, exactly, but something close enough to one that I always walked back to the house afterward, feeling steadier than I had when I'd walked out. Grace chose an architecture program on the West Coast, partly for the program itself, and partly, she admitted freely, because she wanted at least 4 years of building a reputation entirely apart from the Whitlock name before she ever let anyone in a classroom or a firm know exactly whose daughter she was. She submitted her portfolio under her middle name for the first 2 years of applications, a small act of independence I recognized immediately and never once tried to talk her out of, because I remembered too well what it had felt like at her age to want just one thing in the world that belonged entirely to me and nobody else. "You know they're going to find out eventually," I told her the week before she left for her freshman year, both of us packing boxes in her childhood bedroom. "I know. I just want it to be because my work is good enough to stand on its own first, not because someone recognized the last name on the intake form." She folded a sweater with more precision than the task strictly required, not looking at me. "You built 2 entire careers people respect because of what you actually did, not because of who you were married to or whose granddaughter you were. I want the chance to do the same thing." "That's fair," I said, and meant it completely, though something in my chest ached watching her drive away that September with Theo, 28 by then, insisting on being the one to fly out with her for move-in weekend, the same steady protectiveness he'd shown her since the day he first held her in a hospital room and declared his intention to teach her about dinosaurs. She thrived out there, quietly building a reputation across 4 years that had nothing to do with anyone's name but her own. Eventually winning a student design competition with a proposal so structurally inventive that 2 different firms tried to recruit her before she'd even walked at graduation. She came home for the ceremony with a fiancé in tow, a structural engineer named Marcus Boyd, quiet and steady in a way that reminded me pleasantly of Daniel, who had apparently proposed on a beach at sunset with a ring he'd designed and fabricated himself. An engineering flex so specifically tailored to Grace's own sensibilities that I laughed out loud when she showed it to me. "He gets it," she said, holding up her hand to admire the ring, a geometric setting that looked more like a small piece of structural art than a traditional piece of jewelry. "He actually gets what I care about. That matters more than almost anything else," I told her. "Find someone who understands what you actually value, not just someone who says the right things about it." We hosted the wedding at the Nantucket House 2 summers later, the garden dressed in string lights again, the same understated ceremony style Daniel and I had chosen decades earlier, though Grace insisted on designing the entire outdoor structure herself, a temporary pavilion built specifically for the occasion that somehow managed to feel both permanent and ephemeral at once, the kind of structure only someone who genuinely understood both engineering and emotion could have designed. Theo gave the toast, standing at the head of the table with a glass raised, 32 years old, and by then, a name partner at Renata's firm, having made partner 2 years earlier at an age most litigators considered nearly impossible. "Grace was born the year our mother finally let herself believe good things could actually happen to her without the other shoe dropping," he said, and I felt my breath catch slightly, not expecting the specificity of it. I watched our mother build an entire life out of the wreckage of a bad one, brick by brick, decision by decision, never once cutting a corner just to make things easier. And I watched Grace grow up inside that life, taking for granted things I didn't get to take for granted at her age: safety, steadiness, a father who showed up for absolutely everything. He looked at Grace, and then at Marcus, and then, briefly, at me. "Grace, I hope you build a marriage as steady as the one you grew up watching. And Marcus, if you ever forget how remarkable the woman you just married actually is, I promise you the entire Whitlock family will remind you, loudly and repeatedly, until you get the message." The whole tent laughed, and Grace, radiant in a dress she'd designed herself in the same spirit as everything else about that day, hugged her brother so hard she nearly knocked the microphone out of his hand. The Whitlock Foundation held its 10th anniversary gala the same year Grace's first solo commission broke ground, a community arts center in Brooklyn, her name listed as lead architect for the first time on an actual permit application. A milestone she called me about the moment the paperwork cleared, practically shouting into the phone with an excitement that made me laugh until I cried a little, remembering my own first solo permit 2 decades earlier, and how completely, terrifyingly real it had felt to see my own name attached to something that was actually going to get built. I gave a speech at that anniversary gala too, though a quieter one than the AIA ceremony would eventually call for. Standing in front of a room of Foundation supporters and Harbor House alumni, sharing numbers that still occasionally stopped me cold when I actually sat with them. Over 30,000 women and children served across 26 locations on 2 continents. A legal aid program that had secured protective orders and financial independence for thousands of families who would otherwise have had no realistic path out of the situations they'd found themselves trapped inside. None of this began as a grand plan, I told the room that night. It began as a woman standing in her kitchen, 4 weeks away from the worst and best night of her entire life, trying to figure out how to survive the next several hours. Everything else, every shelter, every legal victory, every child who grew up safe because their mother finally had somewhere real to go, grew out of that one decision to stop apologizing for wanting something better. If there's a lesson in any of it, I think it's simply this. You don't have to know the whole plan before you take the first step out the door. You just have to be willing to take it. The health scare came the year I turned 54, arriving with the particular unglamorous randomness these things always seem to arrive with. A routine mammogram that flagged something the radiologist wanted to look at more closely, followed by a biopsy, followed by 3 of the longest days of my life, waiting for results in a life that had, by then, weathered considerably more dramatic threats than a phone call from an oncologist's office. The diagnosis was early, caught in exactly the stage doctors mean when they use the word treatable, with genuine confidence rather than careful hedging. But the 6 months of treatment that followed were harder than I let most people around me see. I lost my hair to chemotherapy in the same study where I'd once reviewed custody documents at 31, sitting in the same leather chair my grandfather had used for decades, watching clumps of it come away in my hands during a particularly bad week and thinking, with a strange detached clarity, that I had survived worse things than this, even if my body currently disagreed. Daniel never once flinched through any of it, drove me to every appointment, sat through every infusion with a book he rarely actually read, learned to cook the bland, careful meals my stomach could tolerate during the worst weeks, without ever once making me feel like a burden for needing them. Theo flew in from every deposition he could reasonably reschedule. Grace put her Brooklyn project on a brief hold and came home for 6 weeks, sketching quietly in the corner of my hospital room during infusions, occasionally showing me a drawing to distract us both from the slow drip of the IV line. I'm not going anywhere, I told her, during one particularly rough week, catching the fear underneath her careful cheerfulness. I need you to know that. This is scary, but it's not the same kind of scary as anything else this family has already survived. I know that logically, she said. It's harder to feel it logically, though, when it's you in the bed. That's fair, I admitted. I felt exactly the same way about your grandmother near the end. Knowing something intellectually and feeling it in your chest are 2 completely different things. I came through it, in the end. The scans eventually clear enough that my oncologist used words like remission with the same careful confidence she'd once used for treatable. And I marked the 1-year anniversary of my last treatment by doing something I hadn't done since Grace was in elementary school, taking an entire month away from the company and the foundation both. No calls, no emails, just Daniel and the Nantucket house, and long, unhurried mornings on the same deck where so much of the story had already unfolded. You scared me, Daniel admitted, one of those mornings, coffee in hand, watching the water the way my mother once had. More than I let on at the time. I didn't want you carrying my fear on top of your own. I could tell you were scared. I just didn't say anything either, for the same reason. I reached over and took his hand. We're good at that, I think. Protecting each other from the full weight of things, even when it might be healthier to just say it out loud. Maybe. Or maybe that's just what love actually looks like sometimes, carrying a little more than your fair share quietly, so the other person doesn't have to carry it too. I thought about that conversation often in the years that followed, turning it over the way I'd learned to turn over everything that mattered. I thought about my grandfather carrying the weight of watching a security feed alone for weeks before he ever told me what he'd seen. I thought about my mother carrying decades of her own quiet survivals without ever once burdening me with the details until I was old enough to ask directly. I thought about the particular, specific love it takes to carry weight silently on someone else's behalf, and understood, finally, at 55, that I had been surrounded by exactly that kind of love for most of my adult life, even during the years I'd been too exhausted or too frightened to fully recognize it. Priya Nandan retired from the foundation the same year I returned to work full-time, having built the Whitlock Foundation from a single shelter into a network that operated across 2 continents. And I hosted a retirement dinner for her that ran 4 hours longer than scheduled because nobody in that room, myself least of all, wanted the evening to actually end. Her successor, a young woman named Aisha Osei, who had come up through the legal aid program Priya had built, inherited an organization so far beyond what any of us had imagined during that first ribbon cutting that I sometimes had to remind myself, standing in board meetings reviewing expansion plans into a 3rd continent, that it had all genuinely started with a single converted building in Lower Manhattan and a woman who'd needed somewhere to put 6 years of silence. Renata Cruz retired from active litigation the following year as well, though she stayed on as senior counsel to both the foundation and the company, unwilling, she admitted with a laugh, to fully give up a front-row seat to whatever Theo did next in his own career. "I built half my reputation defending you," she told me at her own retirement gathering, a considerably smaller affair than Priya's, exactly as understated as Renata herself had always insisted on being. "I don't intend to miss watching you and your son build the rest of yours." "You didn't just defend me," I told her. "You taught me what it looked like to fight without ever losing yourself in the fighting. I don't think I could have built any of this without watching you do that first." "Everybody keeps telling everybody else that lately," she said, dry as ever. "Must be something about reaching a certain age that makes people finally say the important things out loud, instead of assuming there's always more time." She wasn't wrong. I'd noticed it too. A growing willingness, across all of us, to say the things that mattered while there was still time left to say them. A habit I traced directly back to a letter I'd burned in a fireplace decades earlier, written by a man who'd waited until a prison cell and a diagnosis of his own mortality to finally say anything honest at all. I had promised myself, reading that letter, that I would never let my own honesty wait that long. I had, for the most part, kept that promise. The building that had once been our penthouse changed hands twice over the years, eventually converted from a single sprawling residence into 3 separate units by a developer who had no idea and no particular reason to care about the history the space held for the family that had once lived there. I found out about the conversion almost by accident, scrolling through a real estate listing Grace had sent me as a joke, pointing out that one of the new units was being marketed with the exact same floor-to-ceiling windows I'd once stood beside, watching my husband's hand rest possessively on another woman's back. "Do you want to go see it?" Daniel asked, when I mentioned it to him that evening, half expecting him to talk me out of the idea entirely. Strangely, yes, I think I do. We toured the unit the following week, under the guise of Daniel scouting it as a potential design reference for an unrelated project, walking through rooms that had been gutted and rebuilt so thoroughly that almost nothing of the original layout remained recognizable. The kitchen, where Desmond had cornered me with his tumbler of scotch, was gone entirely. Absorbed into an open-concept living space, with none of the marble counter I remembered leaning against, gathering the courage to walk back into that party. The spot where the chandelier had hung, hiding a camera that would eventually end an empire, was now occupied by a sleek, recessed lighting fixture that gave no indication anything of consequence had ever happened beneath it. I stood in the middle of that unrecognizable space and felt, to my genuine surprise, almost nothing at all. No grief, No lingering fear, just the strange, hollow curiosity of visiting a place that had once meant everything and now meant absolutely nothing. A room that had been so thoroughly rebuilt it no longer had any power to reach backward and touch me. "How do you feel?" Daniel asked, watching me carefully. "Lighter than I expected to," I admitted. I think some part of me was afraid this would undo something. It didn't. It's just a room now. A nice room, actually, badly designed lighting aside. I managed a small laugh. I think I needed to see that it was just a room. We didn't buy it, obviously. The developer's asking price was absurd even by Manhattan standards, and neither of us had any real desire to live inside a building that carried that particular weight of memory, however hollowed out that memory had eventually become. But I was grateful, walking out of that building for what I assumed would be the last time in my life, for the strange clarity the visit had given me. That the past, however dramatically it shapes you, doesn't have to remain a place you're still afraid to walk through. Sometimes it becomes exactly what that penthouse had become. Just a room, badly lit, occupied now by someone who had no idea what had once happened there, and no reason it should matter to them if they did. I established a scholarship in my grandfather's name that same year, funded through Whitlock Holdings directly rather than the foundation, aimed at young women pursuing degrees in finance and architecture who came from backgrounds where nobody in their immediate family had ever built the kind of generational security that had, whatever its costs, ultimately given me the resources to fight back against Julian in the first place. I understood by then, in a way I hadn't fully understood at 31, that my own survival had depended on privileges most women in situations like mine simply didn't have access to. A grandfather with an empire, and a private investigator on retainer. A lawyer whose fees were never a genuine obstacle. A jet fueled and waiting on a tarmac. I had built Harbor House to give some measure of that same safety net to women who had none of it. The Nathaniel Whitlock Scholarship, I hoped, would give a different kind of safety net entirely. The kind that let a talented young woman build her own leverage before she ever needed it, rather than scrambling to find it in a crisis. The first recipient, a 19-year-old from a working-class neighborhood in Queens named Destiny Alvarez, no relation, as it turned out, to the detective who had once interviewed me about Julian's crimes, though the coincidence made me smile when I noticed it on her application, wrote me a letter after her first year that I kept framed in the study, beside the photograph from the penthouse hallway. "Ms. Whitlock," she wrote, "I don't come from money, and I don't come from a family that ever talks about money either, which I think you probably understand better than most people would. This scholarship didn't just pay for my tuition. It told me, for the first time in my whole life, that someone thought I was worth investing in before I'd proven anything at all. I don't know exactly what I'm going to build with my degree yet, but I know I'm going to build something, and I know I'm going to remember exactly who made it possible for me to even try." I read that letter more times than I probably should admit, and I thought, each time, about a woman standing in a kitchen doorway 20-something years earlier, being told by her father-in-law that she was nothing more than a placeholder, a pretty face who'd married up and forgotten how to fight. I thought about how thoroughly, completely wrong he had been, and how much of the life I'd eventually built had grown directly out of proving it. Theo's own daughter was born the spring I turned 58, a girl he and his wife, a public defender named Naomi he'd met during a joint case years earlier, and married in a ceremony every bit as understated as his mother's had been, named Eleanor, after Naomi's own grandmother, though everyone in the family immediately started calling her Nell within the first week of her life, a nickname that stuck so completely that most of us eventually forgot she had a longer name at all. I held her for the first time in the same hospital room where I'd once held Theo himself 30 years earlier, and felt something come full circle in a way that caught me entirely off guard. A wave of emotion so complete, I had to sit down in the visitor's chair before I trusted my own legs to hold me up through it. "You okay, Mom?" Theo asked, watching me carefully the way he'd learned to watch everyone he loved. A habit I recognized as one more inheritance he'd never asked for and had turned, through sheer force of will, into something protective rather than anxious. "I'm more than okay," I said, looking down at Nell's small, unbothered face, so impossibly new to a world that had already, in its own complicated way, shaped every single person standing in that room. "I'm just remembering holding you in a room almost exactly like this one, 30 years ago, having absolutely no idea what kind of life we were about to build together." "Turned out pretty well, I think," he said, settling into the chair beside mine. "Turned out better than I ever let myself hope for that first year." I traced a finger gently along Nell's tiny hand, watching her fingers instinctively curl around it, the same gesture Theo had made at exactly this age. The same gesture I imagined every infant in every generation of every family had made since long before any of us existed to notice it. "I hope she gets your steadiness. And I hope she never has to learn the hard way what it costs to build that kind of steadiness from nothing." "She won't," Theo said, with the particular quiet certainty I'd come to recognize as entirely his own, distinct from anything either of his parents had given him, built instead from 30 years of watching what it actually took to make a promise like that come true. "She's got a whole family standing between her and anything that would ever try to take that steadiness away from her. That's the whole point of everything we built, isn't it?" I couldn't argue with that, and I didn't try to. Grace and Marcus had their first child 2 years later, a son they named Nathaniel after my grandfather. Born the same week Grace's Brooklyn Arts Center, her first solo commission, now expanded into a small but respected portfolio of civic buildings across 3 boroughs, won a regional design award that named her, at only 29, one of the most promising architects of her generation, an honor she accepted 6 weeks postpartum, exhausted and radiant in equal measure, with baby Nathaniel asleep against her chest in a carrier the entire time. "Grandfather would have lost his mind over this," my mother would have said, had she lived to see it. And I found myself saying it out loud anyway, standing in the audience at Grace's award ceremony, because some habits of honoring the dead never fully go away, and I'd stopped trying to make them. We gathered at the Nantucket house every summer after that, the family growing larger and louder each year. Theo and Naomi and Nell, Grace and Marcus and baby Nathaniel. Daniel and I anchoring the whole unruly, joyful mess of it from the same wraparound porch where I'd once cried into my mother's shoulder at 2 a.m, holding an 8-month-old and believing, with a fragile hope I'd barely trusted at the time, that we were finally, actually, free. We were. We had been, for a very long time by then, though it had taken years for that fact to stop feeling like something I needed to keep proving, over and over, to a version of myself that was still, somewhere underneath everything I'd built, occasionally waiting for the other shoe to drop. It never did. Not because the world had stopped being capable of cruelty. I knew better than most people how capable of cruelty it remained. But because I had finally, fully, built a life sturdy enough to absorb whatever cruelty might still come, surrounded by people who had never once needed me to be smaller than I actually was, in a house that had never once made me feel like anything other than exactly who I wanted to be. I stood on the stage of a convention center in Los Angeles, 62 years old, accepting a second honor from the same institute a decade after the first. This one recognizing not a single body of work, but an entire career considered, in the words of the citation, foundational to a new generation's understanding of what trauma-informed public architecture could actually accomplish. The room was fuller than it had been 10 years earlier, filled with colleagues who had, by then, spent a full decade watching Harbor House's design principles quietly reshape shelter architecture across the country, and competitors who had, in more cases than I would have predicted, become genuine friends across the particular camaraderie of an industry small enough that everyone eventually collided with everyone else more than once. I walked to the podium slower than I once had, my hair fully gray now, my hands showing the particular lines of a life that had asked a great deal of them and, more often than not, gotten it. But my eyes were steady, the way they'd been steady the night I walked out of that penthouse 31 years earlier. And my voice, when I finally spoke, carried the same calm certainty my grandfather had once used to tell me, over the phone in the back of a town car, that we were very proud of me. 31 years ago, I began. I was a stay-at-home wife with a cheating husband, a newborn son, and absolutely no idea what the rest of my life was going to look like beyond the next several hours. I had no career of my own at that point, no independent income, no plan beyond simply surviving one particular night. I paused, letting the room settle into the particular quiet that always followed that admission, no matter how many times I made it. Tonight, I stand in front of you as someone who has designed buildings on 3 continents, built a foundation that has served more than 40,000 women and children, and raised 2 remarkable children who have each, in their own way, spent their careers trying to make the world slightly less cruel than the one their mother once had to survive. I looked out at the crowd, finding the faces that mattered most among the hundreds gathered there. My mother wasn't in the audience anymore. She'd been gone 9 years by then. But I felt her presence anyway, the particular steadiness she'd taught me on that Nantucket deck, telling me crying was for funerals and not for victories, though I'd broken that rule more than once since and stopped apologizing for it. None of this would have been possible without the people who believed in me before I'd proven anything at all, I continued. My mother, who taught me that survival is built one unglamorous morning at a time. My grandfather, who gave me the tools to fight back when fighting back felt impossible, and who never once let me forget that I was capable of using them myself. I found Daniel in the crowd, 64 now, watching me with the same patient warmth he'd carried across 3 decades together. My husband, Daniel, who showed me that love was never supposed to cost you the size of who you actually are. I found Theo, 33, Nell asleep against his shoulder despite the late hour, Naomi's hand resting on his arm. My son, Theo, who has spent his entire career going after men exactly like the one who once tried to convince me I was worth nothing at all. I found Grace, 29 years old, Nathaniel balanced on her hip, Marcus beside her, her own growing body of work already beginning to eclipse mine in ways that filled me with nothing but pride. And my daughter Grace, who is already building rooms more welcoming than any I ever managed to design myself. The applause rose before I'd even finished, but I lifted a hand, not quite ready to step back yet. I want to say one more thing, because I think it matters more than any award citation ever could. If you are sitting in a room tonight, or in any room, feeling smaller than you actually are, feeling like you are occupying space you haven't earned, or apologizing for needs that are entirely reasonable, or waiting for permission to want something better than what you currently have, I want you to hear this clearly. You do not need anyone's permission. You do not need a perfect plan, or a fueled jet on a private tarmac, or a grandfather with an empire behind him, though I will freely admit those things helped considerably in my own case. You need exactly one thing to start. The decision that you are done apologizing for taking up the full size of your own life. Everything else, I promise you, can be built afterward, one deliberate decision at a time. The applause that followed lasted long enough that I finally stepped back from the podium mid-ovation, my heart fuller than I had words left to describe, and made my way back to my seat between Daniel and Theo, both of them reaching for my hands at nearly the same moment. That night, back in the hotel room, I sat by the window looking out at a city that had never been mine, and somehow, over the decades, had become a comfortable, familiar backdrop to some of the most important nights of my adult life. Daniel joined me eventually, handing me a glass of wine, settling into the chair across from mine. "You've come a long way, Vivian," he said, echoing words he'd said to me once, a decade earlier, on a different hotel balcony after a different ceremony. "I have," I agreed. "Are you happy?" I didn't need to think about the answer this time, the way I once had. "I'm happy," I said. "I've been happy for a very long time now. I think I just needed enough distance from that penthouse to finally believe it was allowed to last." We flew home to New York the next morning, and I spent that evening, once the house had gone quiet and everyone had finally settled into their own beds, sitting alone in my study with the framed photograph I'd kept on the desk for more than 3 decades. Myself at 31, captured on a hallway security camera, the night I walked out of a party with a baby on my hip, my chin held high, my eyes fixed straight ahead on a door I had no intention of turning back from. Underneath the photograph, in my own handwriting from all those years ago, were the words I'd written the week after the divorce was finalized. The moment everything changed. I picked up the photograph and held it for a long moment, studying the face of a woman who had no idea in that instant exactly how far the road ahead of her was going to stretch, or how much it was eventually going to give her in exchange for everything it had first demanded she survive. "Thank you," I whispered to her, the way I had whispered it to that same photograph more times over the years than I could count. "Thank you for being brave enough to walk out that door before you had any proof it would actually be worth it." I set the photograph back down on the desk, exactly where it had sat for 31 years, and turned off the lamp. Outside my window, the city hummed the way it always hummed at that hour. Car horns somewhere in the distance, a siren fading towards some emergency that had nothing to do with me. The ordinary, indifferent churn of 8 million lives continuing forward without any particular awareness of the ones that had, against considerable odds, managed to build something worth staying for. I sat there a moment longer in the dark, listening to all of it, and then I got up, because that's what the whole of this life had taught me, more thoroughly than any single lesson before or since. You get up and you keep moving forward, not because the fear ever fully disappears, but because you have finally, after everything, built something worth moving forward toward. There is one more thing I think about, more often than almost anything else from those years, and it has nothing to do with courtrooms or boardrooms or award ceremonies at all. It's a smaller memory, the kind that doesn't make it into any speech, and I've never told it to anyone outside my own family, not even Renata, who knows nearly everything else about that period of my life in exacting legal detail. It happened about a year after the divorce was finalized, on an ordinary Tuesday evening with nothing remarkable scheduled at all. I was giving Theo a bath, 18 months old by then, splashing water everywhere with the gleeful destructiveness only a toddler can bring to bath time, and I caught sight of myself in the mirror above the sink, tired, makeup-free, hair pulled back in a way I would never have allowed anyone at a Callaway party to see me wear it, laughing at something my son had just done with a rubber duck that made absolutely no logical sense as a joke, but was, somehow, still the funniest thing either of us had encountered all week. I remember stopping mid-laugh and simply looking at my own reflection for a long moment, genuinely startled by what I saw there. Not the tiredness, not the plain, undone hair. The eyes. They were the eyes of a woman who had nothing left to perform for anyone, sitting on a bathroom floor with wet knees and a delighted, splashing toddler, entirely, completely herself, for what felt like the first time in longer than I could accurately measure. This is it, I remember thinking, with a clarity that surprised me. This is what it was actually supposed to feel like, this whole time. I didn't know yet about the foundation I'd eventually build, or the awards, or Daniel, or Grace, or any of the enormous, sprawling life that particular Tuesday evening was quietly, invisibly setting into motion. I only knew that for the first time in longer than I could remember, I wasn't bracing for anything. I was simply there, on a bathroom floor, laughing at a rubber duck with my son, and it was, without any qualification or asterisk attached to it, enough. Everything else, the shelters, the buildings, the awards, the grandchildren, the whole enormous architecture of a life rebuilt from the ashes of one that had nearly convinced me I wasn't worth saving, grew outward from that single, unremarkable bathroom floor moment, the way the biggest things in a life so often do, quietly, without fanfare, in an ordinary room, on an ordinary evening, when nobody was watching except a delighted toddler and a woman, finally, fully allowed to simply be exactly who she already was. I think about that evening every single time someone asks me, at a gala or a conference or a family dinner, what the actual turning point of my life was. They usually expect me to say the penthouse, or the town car, or the courtroom, or the award stage. I never do. I always say the bathroom floor, and I always watch a flicker of confusion cross their face before I explain. And I've come, over the years, to genuinely love that particular flicker of confusion, because it means I've told them something true, instead of something they were already expecting to hear. That is, I think, the whole of what I would want anyone reading this to actually understand, if any of it is worth understanding at all. The grand, dramatic moments matter enormously, and I would never tell anyone to undervalue the courage it takes to walk out a door, to testify in a courtroom, to stand at a podium and tell several hundred strangers the truth about the worst night of your life. But the actual life, the one worth building all of that courage toward, gets built in the small rooms afterward, on ordinary evenings, in moments so unremarkable that you might almost miss them if you're not paying close enough attention. I paid attention, eventually. It took me longer than I would like to admit. But I got there, and once I did, I never once let myself stop. That, in the end, is the whole story. Or as much of it as fits inside any telling. Not the fall of an empire built on lies, though that happened too, and not the rise of a foundation that has, by now, quietly changed more lives than I will ever personally know the names of, though that happened as well. It is simply the story of a woman who once stood in a kitchen holding her son, being told by every voice in the room that she was worth less than the man standing beside her, and who decided, on one particular ordinary night, that she no longer believed a single word of it. I still keep that photograph on my desk. I suspect I always will. Not because I need reminding of who I once was, but because I like remembering. On the ordinary evenings when the city hums outside my window and the house is finally quiet, exactly how far one decision, made with shaking hands and a fueled jet waiting on a distant runway, was eventually able to carry an entire life. We keep moving forward. That is, I have come to believe, the entire secret. Not because the fear disappears, and not because the past ever fully stops asking to be remembered, but because somewhere behind you, if you are patient and stubborn and lucky enough, you eventually build something worth all of it, worth the fear, worth the years, worth every single door you ever had to find the courage to walk through alone.